Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Erica Hartley and I'm the director of the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project, and welcome to our 2025 Summer Lecture Series. Tonight we have a special guest in store, Cathrine Davis. She started out as a summer camper, so she's one of our own. Many years ago, and then she went on to Western. She got her BA from Western, working with Michael Lusani and several of his grad students who we still get to pal around with today. And then she went on to Laval University for her MA and recently graduated from the College of William and Mary. So yeah, congratulations for the success. So Kevin's current research interests are 17th and 18th century material culture and archaeology, specifically lead seals, which she's going to tell all about tonight with her presentation, Reweaving Forgotten Histories, Lead Cloth Seals, Fort St. Joseph, and French Textiles. All right, thank you.
Okay, mic on? Okay, good. So, I'm glad to see so many familiar faces here today. Some of you have no doubt heard bits and parts of this, and I know that my last presentation here was super hyper-focused on one particular community in France and their implications in the Canada trade and the relation to Fort St. Joseph. And for this one, I just wanted to kind of step back and look at everything that we kind of have figured out for at least the southwest of France. I don't want to hop around too much, you guys all look like, you know. So I'm going to focus on this main region of Canada trade and textile production there, and how it relates back to Fort St. Joseph, and expands on the people that aren't written about necessarily. And that's kind of what I want you to keep in mind throughout this talk today. So this year, right, we have the resurgence of French culture, right? We have this height of the fur trade theme for everything at Fort St. Joseph. You know, the height of the fur trade very much was this early 18th century, just before the French Indian War, of course. And a lot of people that I have run into at historical conferences say, that's a really boring time period in New France. And so then I respond, actually, it's really interesting, especially if you're a fur trade archaeologist, because this is when everything is circulating. This is when all sorts of economic rise is on in New France. You know, in the St. Lawrence Valley, they're starting to finally settle in. They're starting to expand agriculturally into the North Country. And in the Pays d'Arnaud, right here, it's the height of fur trade, right? We're maintaining alliances, and we're still competing with English for power, and there's all these different dynamics going on. So I'm going to demonstrate just how fun, colorful, and exciting that period is by talking about economics. So actually, we'll kind of get more into the textile trade out of France and into New France, and we'll do that using lead seals from Fort St. Joseph, so you'll know it relates directly back to this site. So when I talk about these people all the way across the Atlantic, these objects just draw them right across back to here, and they connect them in a very interesting way. So think about the different things that these seals have been around, the different textiles they're related to, the sheep, the people spinning, the people weaving, all these different people, places, and all connected in these artifacts that show up right here, a couple blocks that way. Right? That's the amazing thing about lead seals, we tell these hidden histories. So, what exactly are lead cloth seals? That's a question I have to start every single presentation with, because even archaeologists who have been doing this for years are not necessarily familiar with them as an artifact type. So they are they're much smaller than they appear in these pictures, trust me. They're about usually 1 to 2 centimeters in diameter, although I've seen some larger ones get up to 5 centimeters. Those are kind of some weird medieval European ones that I have pictures of at the end if we get there in question period. But what they do is they basically function like clothing tags nowadays. They are going to tell you where something is made, what the contents are, maybe what size it is. So there's actually one seal right here that my lovely friends in the City of Amsterdam collections took pictures of for me, that has actually right here the length, the weight, and the size just marked right on it. So that's the sort of, quantifying information you might see on these. You'll also see keys to their origin. So this right here is actually an early 18th century or early 17th century seal from Augsburg, which is currently in Germany, but was part of the Hanseatic League and all that. Well, actually, it was separate from Hanseatic League, but we'll get into that some other day if you're interested. So this A is a clue to where it came from. That's A for Augsburg, right? But you have to know. You have to look at enough of them. You have to talk to people in Europe that are finding them on their weekends off and they're digging the fields to understand exactly what that reference is and to make those ties. So these were used starting in the Middle Ages. Sort of in the 14th century, we see the first documentation pop up in England, although their use is probably a little bit further back. And lead seals in general that weren't used on textiles were used even earlier in time back to the Hellenistic era in Greece. So I will put a little note on here that these are not bale seals or bag seals, but lead cloth seals. So we're specifically looking at ones that mark textiles. These are things. There are bale seals and there are bag seals. These are just not them. So thinking about textile production, because that's what we're looking at ultimately when we look at these lead seals, we're looking for clues about the textiles that march, right? The seals are very interesting in their own right, but this research I'm presenting looks at the people, places, and things that connected by the textiles, right? So that's the good they're marking. That's the thing that everybody wants. So textile production in Europe was usually carried out as seasonal work by lower class people. So you would have farm workers that during the agricultural year would be out, shearing sheep, planting fields, harvesting, and then in the off season, when that's not going on, they might seek work in town, in factories, or they might work at home in the putting out system, which is essentially you're going to have a merchant request, a cloth to be made. And they're going to go to each party involved in the steps of production and secure the materials and the work and all that, essentially. So they're going to go to a bunch of spinners and say, here's the raw wool I got from such and such, turn it into yarn. Here's this yarn I got from such and such, turn it into a cloth, and so on. So it's something that if you're wealthy, you're not doing this. You might be a dyer, or you might be a finisher if you're somewhat wealthy. You'd be an artisan class person then. But most of the work being done is people who are in poverty and very, very lower class. And those are the people that slip through the cracks that history kind of forgets about. So I'm going to try to kind of hint at them and give you guys, sort of reveal them again using these seals to kind of bring them up into the conversation. We're not just talking about cloth merchants. We're talking about the people doing the actual labor. So here is an example of some of that labor. It is dirty. Obviously, we have people in undergarments, in pits of water. This is fulling, actually. So this originally in the Middle Ages and in this method they're using here before the fulling mill, or at the same time as the fulling mill. They're going to be doing this in a combination of various chemicals, fuller's earth, which was cat litter, and excrement, right, so urine, which is really, really good at roughing the wool up a little bit and giving it that fuzz over the weave. That you'll notice, like a blanket with a wool sweater, you can get a layer over where the knit is. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to bring it all together so that the weave doesn't separate, right? So really dirty work. We have dyers, which were subjected to all different sorts of chemicals, even though they were sort of scientists of their day because they had to know what chemicals combined to get just the right color. So they were keeping very careful notes and really well-guarded secrets because they didn't want others to take that dye recipe and get rich off of it too, because that's their dye recipe. So those are kind of, the very poorest of the poor fullers, slightly more elevated class, you have dyers. And then you have the more wealthy people involved, the inspectors, right? So here we have actually a scene of someone applying a lead cloth seal to textiles. Right here, this gentleman, these guys are inspectors, so they're kind of mucky mucks in the city of Leiden, the Netherlands. They have a wonderful museum all about sealing there. It's the original sealing hall. You can see the inspection stamps marked on all the fireplaces. All the inspectors slam their marks into the wood fireplace as soon as they got it. So it's kind of a record of who's there. Really interesting place, but you have this gentleman here sealing. These guys are inspecting. Down here you can see them measuring. So we're looking at the quality of the weave here. They're holding up to the light, making sure there's no holes. And when it's finally passed, it gets a seal. So we're going to look at France, not the Netherlands, even though a lot of things carry over. There's some different particularities here and there, especially in where sealing is being done and what offices are doing sealing. So it's much more rigorous in France in this part of the 18th century. The prevailing economic thought is this Colbertus thought, where you want to amass the most amount of specie, which is gold and silver. You want all the gold and silver. You want your enemies to have not as much gold and silver, because then you're the ones in power and you don't have to worry about getting attacked, right? So they're trying to get as much gold and silver from elsewhere as possible by, really, really encouraging domestic manufacture and high quality domestic manufacture. So they're checking everything that's being made in France to make sure that it'll outcompete everybody else in Europe. That's the idea. So that's what these seals are ultimately serving, is this system. So there's lots of different offices that are represented, and I won't necessarily go into those right now. There's a little bit more about them in the chapter I wrote in Dr. Smith's book from 2019. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. It seems like yesterday. So looking at France, here's sort of where we're occupied with all these circled places we're going to visit, starting with La Rochelle, Rochefort, and Bordeaux, which are ports outwards. So this right here is Place de la Bourse, which is sort of place of the purse, right? It's the commercial center of Bordeaux. This is where the port initially ran right up to, right? So you would disembark all your goods right in this plaza here, and they would go into customs to get checked. Customs building is this side right here, actually. They have a nice little sign still from the 18th century, customs. And in the Customs Museum, they have a similar seal to this. This one is from Fortress Louisbourg, which is the entrepot, right? So that's where everything is coming from France into New France. It's the first place it stops. After that, it goes to Quebec City. And this right here is what I have sort of determined through looking at pictures of how things are packaged. That this is probably actually a bale seal. So this is going to go on the outside of a bale, but we're not talking about the ones that fit in canoes. We're talking about man-sized bales, right? Really large ones, and these are exclusively packs of cloth in these bales. And once that gets to New France, to Quebec or Montreal or Louisbourg, those bales are being broken up, and you're putting together smaller bales to go in canoes that are trade assortments, right? So you're preparing it for each post. What is interesting to people commercially at each post? So what do the natives want at Fort St. Joseph? Well, they want some kettles, they want some cloth, they might want some gun flints. We're going to put those all in one bale that is smaller and fit in the canoe for that post, right? So you could have multiple posts in one canoe, or you could have it all going to the same place. But either way, you have to do something that involves breaking open one of those, and those are what those larger seals are applied to, from what I can tell. So La Rochelle, Bordeaux, and Rochefort were the main ports out to Canada. There were some others involved too, but those were kind of the big ones. Rochefort actually was an arsenal, so that's like a naval base for the French, so a lot of military supplies are coming from there. So if you have stuff to outfit the militia in New France, for example, it might be coming from there. Not originally from there, but it will be exiting France at that point. La Rochelle is the one that everybody thinks about. La Rochelle has a lot of familial connections to New France as well. A lot of families based in La Rochelle have branches that ended up in Quebec, and that's somewhat true for each of these port towns, and even for some towns further inland. So, going down the canal system that runs through southern France. This was put in place by Philippe d'Orléans, which is Louis XIV's brother. Embarks on this big project to make it possible to get things from the Mediterranean all the way to the Atlantic by going through France, right? So we're going to have the Canal du Midi, which is the famous one. Once that hits Toulouse, it will become a sub-segment of it called the Canal du Garonne, which is after the Garonne River. So we're going to go downstream to Montauban, which is the town that I focus on the most in some of my other research, because it particularly interests me to see the family dynamics and the intermarriages and sort of the webs of alliance that are in this town. And what also kind of spices it up is they have this Huguenot identity as well, which is very in opposition to the very Catholic crown of France. So this is the central plaza of Montreal. These were all originally little stalls for merchants. They actually have, in the vaults of them, they have little merchant marks at the center of each vault, which is very interesting because that's kind of who it originally belonged to, or who originally did business in that area. And from Montauban, we have at least these two seals. There's a lot more, but these are some decent examples. And these are both seals from the same family. It's the Mariette family, which we see that family distributed all over North America, actually. There's even one in Charleston, I believe. And you can kind of see that here. A lot of people think that these are guys in a canoe, but if you look carefully, one of them is standing up and pointing the opposite direction to everybody else is paddling, so it's more of a rowboat situation, which it's probably representing a canal boat that would have gone on the Tarn that runs through that town and alongside a lot of the merchant houses and places of manufacture. So Montauban is most famous, if you ask any French person in the area, for making kedzi, which is a really rough twill woven woolen cloth. This is actually an example of kedzi. It's a 19th century sailor's jacket that is in the musée, the collections of the Musée Anglaise in Montreal, or in Montauban, sorry, different mountain. And you can kind of see the texture of it in this picture, which is interesting. It's a favorite of sailors because it's water repellent a little bit. That wool sort of wicks away the water when you're working on sort of a rainy boat deck and everything. So it was very popular with working class people that had to do hard, soggy jobs. So Montauban is also the center of the Canada trade in textiles, which means that though they're most famous for making kedzi, that's not all they're making, and that's not all that they're putting together for export, right? So not everything going through Montauban is necessarily made there, right? It could be transitioning through there, through the merchant houses, and off to an exporter. But what was made in Montauban, or finished in Montauban, usually was produced in what are called maisons-usines, which is a factory house. And I have an example of one of those on the next page. But they're kind of tall, multi-layered houses. And there's always a vault for storing things, or if you're doing, maybe dyeing in that vault. And you have all the production under the watchful eye of the merchant, the Canada merchant, who would live in the upper levels with his family. So production in Montauban is going to draw resources from the surrounding area, which is a lot of woad from Toulouse, likely, and a lot of wool from Mazamet and the surrounding countryside. This is an example of a maison-usine. This is actually the house of the Mariette family. And right here, where I'm standing, if you can think of it, is where the Tarn River runs. So this backs right up to the river so they can easily ship things out to Bordeaux. They can get things coming from Toulouse further downriver. There's these really strong merchant dynasties where you see father and son passing the Canada trade to the next. And in a lot of the records that you find in the archives there, they refer to themselves as négociants Canadian merchants. So though they're not what we would think of as Canadian, they're thinking of themselves as like sort of inextricably linked with Canada and New France. So Montauban is the Huguenot heartland, and it was the center of Protestant resistance to the Catholic crown. There's actually holes in the steeple of one of the churches there from when the King of France laid siege to the town and bombarded this church. So it's very, and that kind of still persists today, where the people I was staying with in Montauban were very, very cool. I stayed in Airbnb. And they were older, and they said, well, we remember people talking about when we were younger how the Catholic Church in town is not the pink bricks, right? So these pink colored bricks are local bricks. When they built the Catholic Church in that town, they brought stone that's white from elsewhere, put it there, and they said, well, that's not from here, that's not us. That was imposed on us. So there's still this interesting culture of Huguenot identity that's there that I was really kind of interested in getting at, and I'm still interested in getting at. But so hopefully when I go back to Montauban, I'll have a little bit of an interview with a bunch of people and see what I can come up with, because that I find really interesting. So when Canada falls to the British in 1759, 1760, you see almost immediately in these towns, all the merchants go under. They lose all their money, and they pull all the other merchants down with them because they're all intermarried, right? So they're all these partnerships, and when one of them fails, it can pull everybody else down with them. So you can see just how interconnected everything is by sort of what happens in Montauban after that fall. So moving on to Toulouse. Toulouse is sort of more well known as a textile place and as a dye place than a lot of these other locations. It has, you can see sort of the tradition reflected in little things you see here and there. Like a lot of the town is about violets, so there's a lot of stuff, because violet perfume and violet tea, that's a really thriving sort of economy there for tourists. They're like, you go to Toulouse if you want something that's violet, right? And then the other color you see everywhere is like this bluish color, sort of not quite the blue of my dress, and that's the woad color. And since the Middle Ages at least, Toulouse has been associated with that woad trade. But here we actually have a grave marker within this convent. This is the Couvent des Jacobins in Toulouse. And it's a memorial plate for someone buried there who donated a lot to that monastery, who was a finisher, a tondeur des draps. So this is placed there in memory for him and his. And it's 1745, and right here you see that he even paid to have a pair of finishing shears carved in to his gravestone. So these are huge shears. They're probably about maybe 1.5 meters long. And they're very sharp, and they would use them to cut all the fluff off and make an even surface on the cloth as they were finishing it after it had been fulled. And here is woad. So this is essentially ground woad right here. This was a big deal until indigo came about. So indigo starts catching on sort of mid-18th century, and it comes from far away. It comes from the Indies. It has to be, cultivated, and that was something that the Ottoman Empire blocked a lot of that from Europe. So, for the traditional blue dye for Europe was this that grew locally. This woad plant here has these little yellow flowers. I actually have some growing in my backyard right now, and you would process that into woad balls, and often they'd be shipped like this. And then once you process those down and fermented them, and it smelled really bad when you did this, it would be this clear blue pigment. And so that goes into paints and goes into dyes and goes into cloth especially. So that's something that Toulouse is very, very famous for, along with the Azores, as I have found in some of my research. So seals from sites here in North America, so not necessarily Fort St. Joseph, but other sites have seals that match those from Fort St. Joseph or match names from Fort St. Joseph. So the Mariette family, for example, shows up at Fort Ticonderoga, which is in upstate New York, but that was a French fort as well. And seals from that place, because the marks are associated front and back on the seals, show that those merchants in Montauban were getting cloth sent to them from the General Hospital in Toulouse. So in Toulouse, you have l'Hôpital de la Garde, which is right here. A lot of this actually got torn down recently. I think they've been renovating it a lot. It was sort of like an old folks home for a while recently, but originally it was built not to treat medical conditions. So it's not that kind of hospital. It was more of sort of a home for impoverished people or disabled people. So it was a little bit of that. So it was anybody that, the powers that be didn't want on the streets, right? So this really weird kind of patronizing attitude towards the poor and people that have a hard time, they would just kind of be shut up in this hospital. And they would do work there because that's good for everybody. It's especially good for the French state. So, the guys in charge were like, this is a great idea. Let's round all these poor people up and just make them work. That's great. Not so much for the people that were actually living through this. There were a lot of flea-infested mattresses. Not a great place to grow up if you're an orphan. Not a great place to get older if you're an older person. They had prostitutes confined here as well. So you actually have prostitutes and orphans creating blankets across the River, and those are being shipped all the way to Canada for the French and Indian War, actually. They show up in the King's magazines at Ticonderoga, these blankets and clues. And knowing kind of where they started, people at the time, I don't know, were even quite aware of what was going on. So it was interesting going there and thinking about all these people that were living there and producing this stuff. And you think over here, they're like, oh, it's great. It's the fur trade. Blankets are great. And then you look back and you're like, yeah, but somebody had to make these, and knowing that it was these people that were having a harder time is something to think about. So moving on from Toulouse, we're going to go to Carcassonne, which is rather scenic. It has the medieval cité there. These turrets are not original. Blame the 19th century and Victorians. But everything else is, dates back to some of the late Roman period stuff right here, that tower and that brickwork pattern. But it's this kind of imposing city along the Aude. And some of these down here are more 18th century houses. Actually, in between the walls to the castles, the fortified city, there used to be, kind of like hovels and smaller houses in there, but the Victorians didn't think that was very scenic, so they just kind of built that. But you can imagine that a lot of the people involved in textile work might have lived in those sort of places. And this right here is a seal from Fort St. Joseph. And it's marking heavy woolen cloth from Carcassonne, so we're not talking about a blanket, but more of a heavy broadcloth. And that was being produced in the Manufacture Royale, probably, which is right alongside the Aude. You'll see kind of that woad paint, that woad blue paint I was talking about all over this. You'll also notice, if you have really keen eyes, that it just says Manufacture, and then there's like this garbled kind of chipped out part right here that said Royale, but they had a little something over there called the French Revolution, and did not take kindly to the word royal being anywhere anymore. So they're manufacturing in this place mostly a carletin, which would be a type of drap, right, a heavy woolen. And the carletin were these scarlet-colored broadcloths that were really sought after by Native Americans. And actually, in the 1750s, when we get into that point, you'll have Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, he's actually the aide-de-camp for the General Montcalm, the French general in the French Canadian War over here. And Bougainville actually mentions, he's observing all this trade interaction going on during the war and saying, the natives like this at carletin, but they're saying that the British stuff is better and that it has a better black stripe on the bottom of the cloth. They want this really good black stripe. So Carcassonne, specifically Carcassonne, should work on that and make it better. He actually points out the city as a place that is supplying the Native American trade, which is very interesting. And we see right here at Fort St. Joseph, huge trade hub, we have at least one seal from Carcassonne. At least one. Not to say that any of the ones from Montauban didn't mark off in Carcassonne, just we have one definitely. And here's a larger view of that Manufacture Royale.
30 minutes. We'll be closer to 15 minutes.
Thank you. So right here is kind of a shot of the building of the Manufacture Royale. And you can see that there's these great big windows, and there's lots of them. And that's to let the light in, so that if they're doing weaving or spinning or finishing, they would have light to work by, because this is, of course, before you can just flip a light switch and be able to see what you're doing. You had to work with sunlight. So that's a lot of factory buildings from that proto-industrial period have a lot of those bright windows to allow the workers to see what's going on. So moving up from Carcassonne, we're going to go to Masmé, which is a little bit more of a countryside location. You can see it's situated in these great big rolling hills and cliffsides, which is really good for sheep, actually. And we have lots of seals from Masmé that end up at Fort St. Joseph. And Masmé, in addition to being the name of the town, is also the name of a textile that comes from the town. It's a woolen textile. And what exactly it is, it's I want to say it's a twill woven woolen, but it's not. It's a napped tulle woven woolen, so it has like, it's treated a little bit like a blanket where it has that fuzzy layer over it, but it's put together a little bit differently than some of the blankets. There's a lot of, the same type of woolen made in these towns, but it's somehow slightly different enough that it gets a slightly different name. And that's something that a lot of 18th century historians just have all sorts of fun with, between that and pre-revolutionary weights and measures in France. Nothing was, you could go to Paris and a foot was one thing, and if you go to Marseille, the foot is a different measure. So nothing was uniform, which makes it kind of difficult to figure out what's going on a lot of the time. But masme, we know, is a woolen cloth, and it's something that could have been used either by Native Americans or it could have been used by French colonists, because you want, harder wearing breeches, or you want, the milice, I think at one point has masme vests underneath their coats. So it's light enough that you can wear it in almost all weather. So it's not stuffy the way you think of woolens. So a lot of woolens actually wear rather well in the summer, and they wick off moisture. But you can see here also 1740s date. 1740s date. Not so boring. So in masme, they have Lacan sheep, which are native to that area. And these are kind of oddball sheep, I found. I was doing a little research on what exactly type of wool they were using there, because I've gotten into wool processing, and that's a whole other rabbit hole that we won't get into here. But these sheep actually shed their wool. So you can see right here, there's kind of bare spots on them, and there's all this wool all over the ground. They shed their coats naturally, so you don't have to shear them. A lot of domestic sheep you have to shear, or they'll get stuck in brambles, or they'll overheat. These just kind of shed naturally, and they're mostly used for dairy. So that kind of gets me wondering, what exactly are they using to make wool in masme? Are they bringing it from elsewhere? Is this supplying other places if they have, sheep with light coats that shed? Or are they bringing in sheep from Spain or from elsewhere in France, like the Rambouillet, which was in production, so there might be a predecessor to that, or Merino from Spain. I also ran across the fact that masme was known as a center for dead wool and tanning. So dead wool is when you butcher a sheep for meat, and then you take the sheepskin and you take the fleece off of the sheepskin. So basically that's what that is. So it's more 2 minutes, okay. So that's a little bit different than, shearing it, but it's different because I don't know if maybe at their peak they're being killed for meat, but that's something I haven't run into ever. So this town is specifically noted as having a ton of unemployment and lots of problems after the fall of Canada. But in the 19th century, they kind of regained their footing, and almost everything you find on masme relates to this 19th century textile industry and wool, because you have merino d'Arles that are introduced there, and the onset of industrialization. So our last location is Nimes, and this is rather exciting because I haven't talked a lot about this before, because I think it was found last year, Erica? Yeah? So this is a seal from Nimes, and I didn't highlight it, and I apologize for that, but there's a little crocodile chained to a palm tree. Nimes is, we'll do this first. So Nimes is actually sort of famous in a way you might not expect. So this right here is your blue jeans, right? Denim. If you break down that word in the roots, de Nîmes. It's de Nîmes. So it's a toile de Nîmes, right? A cotton cloth from Nimes that is twill woven. You also have jeans as a possible origin, which is in Italy for Genoa. But I like this one. So Nimes was founded by the soldiers of Augustus Caesar. So after the fall of Cleopatra and Antony at the sea battle of Actium. So traditionally in Roman art, Egypt is usually depicted as a crocodile. So here on this coin you have Egypto capta, captive Egypt, right? And then over here it's a little bit more literal, where you have this chained alligator to a tree, and this was the city, or chained crocodile to a tree, I'm sorry. And this was the city crest of Nimes that was chosen, and you have here abbreviation COLNIM, Colonia Nimensis, which is the Roman name for Nimes. On this side, you can't see it, but trust me, there is a du fil, essentially, so it's an abbreviation for two ply, and then on the outside, I think this is a merchant's name. I have to get a little bit more into it, or a specific stocking maker, because this is a bonneterie. seal. So bonneterie is basically anything that's knit. And in Nimes, what was interesting is they were actually one of the 18 cities allowed by the French crown to use stocking machines to create stockings. Everywhere else it had to be hand knit, right? So you have these little ladies by the fire knitting as fast as they can for a piecework wage, which isn't great. And here you have the starts of industrialization where you're starting to run these stockings on frames to keep up with some of the demand. So bas de Nîmes came in wool and silk. I've seen the silk ones show up at Louisburg. I think I've seen some wool ones as well. And stocking seals are rather small, and they usually specify the ply of the yarn. A lot of the ones from Michel-Mackinac actually also have the ply count. 2 plies seems to be the most common. What's interesting is we have this gentleman here who's learned in the ways of the stocking machine. But if we open up this picture from Diderot, we also see this woman here who is a wine stir. She's taking the yarn that is made on the spinning wheel and plied on the spinning wheel, and then winding it into a form that can be then put into this machine to run it. So there's still, even though, you might be like, ooh, flashy, industrialization, mechanics, there's still these poor people or these women that are sort of the base of that industry that kind of run behind the scenes. So, from what we see here, the 1730s and 40s were a time of significant growth for textile industries in southwest France, and that aligns with the expansion of the North American fur trade and sort of the height of France, New France. France in New France, rather. Lead seals from the later part of the French regime, which is sort of this early 18th century to mid-18th century, attest to the presence here of some sort of permanent population and a lot of trade going on. Because, a lot of these were not necessarily trade cloths that could be coming from these places, and the concentrations we have tend to be around hearths, right? So this is something we'll look a little bit more into coming up soon. Eric and I are going to kind of collaborate and look a little bit at the distribution of lead seals and what that tells us about activities going on at the site, and then also about maybe who's living in what places. So stay tuned for that. This is sort of the opener for that, I think. So there's some sort of clothes making going on at Fort St. Joseph because this is raw cloth that's coming in. This isn't finished garments. So somebody is making something up out of this wool at the site. Or they're taking the tags off and giving the wool to the natives. So it's kind of, we're not entirely sure on that, and it might be something that archaeology can't even tell us because it has a hard time telling us that on other sites. You can also see just how interconnected everything is. When the Canada trade failed and when the British took over, the French producers in towns were impacted negatively, and that left lower class workers without a way to earn income and put more pressure on the poor, which, as we know, in the course of French history, is a path that eventually leads to the guillotine. So you can see sort of the impact of little places like Fort St. Joseph in connection with everything in New France on France itself over time. So thank you so much, and I hope we have lots of time for questions. I think I went a tad bit over, but certainly, contact me if you have questions. There's some business cards over there. If you find me scary and don't want to come talk, which is fine. And thank you to everybody, and I'll turn it over to Erica for question period.
All right, thank you. Oh, that was really well done.
Good.
There's a lot of information.
So it's
Any questions they want to start off with?
So you talked about being opened up and they get to new brands and package trade off. Are they resealing them and seal here?
There's not any evidence for that. We haven't found any sealing pliers or any seals with motifs that would suggest they came directly from Canada. We do have Russian seals in the later 18th century, 19th century, where they're using lead seals to mark different types of fur. So it's sort of a quality mark for seal fur in the Northwest. But that's kind of the only evidence that is strong enough for any sealing going on in North America. Because a lot of these seals had to be made by the dyes to stamp them had to be made by really skilled engravers. If you think about the size of these, and everything has to be engraved in reverse. Essentially the people that are making the seal dyes are going to be the same people that are making coin dyes. So it's a high degree of specialization.
What were the bales? I'm assuming that they were waterproof.
The bales? Yeah, usually out of sailcloth, which is basically a heavy canvas that's treated then with linseed oil to make it somewhat water repellent and waterproof. So if you lose a bale over the side of a canoe, it's still gonna get a little soggy, but it'll like keep most of the splashing off. And you actually see also in some of the bales that are being shipped from France, you see evidence for sailcloth in those bales that's going to places to then be resold in packaging. You see that show up on trade lists.
So what they do, Catherine, is they just recycle that, those sales?
Well, they could recycle the outside of the bales from Europe, but a lot of the bales from Europe contain sailcloth to go especially to those places so that they can make their
You mentioned that it's unclear whether when the other property is sold to the Asian why would they release
It could be that they are cutting up full lengths of cloth into smaller pieces. So like if you have a whole bolt of cloth from like say the defunct Joann's, you could divide that up, and that would be useful to trade if there's multiple people that want some of it. You can get some people some of it. It's just splitting it up to make them right.
So they weren't selling whole bales.
Sorry?
They weren't selling whole bales of cloth.
No, it'd be by the piece probably if you're selling. Yeah, which is how everything would be packaged in here. It'd be by the piece, sealed by the piece, which is one bolt essentially is a piece. That's the way it comes off of the loom. So it'd be sealed by the piece, and then those would be in packets, and there would be multiple packets in a big bale coming from Europe. So you can kind of go through when you're putting together a trade assortment and say, like, this is a packet of this stuff, we'll open that, pull some of that out, put a couple pieces in. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a couple questions about the economics of it. The first one is like, where does the textile industry rank in terms of industries in France at the time period that you're talking about? And then sort of related to his question, like what were these selling for in the New World? Like how much did a bale sell for in today's dollars? And then if you divided that up into like a single piece of cloth for a single garment, do we know?
Yeah, so actually, first question, how big was the textile trade in Europe? The answer is huge. Huge. It is like the main thing. Everybody needs clothes, but they can't just, make clothes out of plastic and thin air like we can today. It's actually like a heavy industry that everybody relies on. And so that was a main source of competition between European nations was this textile creation. Sort of the way that furs were as well. The whole reason the French were here is for furs because the furs in Russia had been declining and they were running out of them and they were hard to get a hold of. So when they got a hold of furs, people can wear it. If people can wear it, it makes a lot of money in Europe at this period. Especially with, the upper classes spending a lot.
Do you know how it compares to like timber or other industries?
Bigger than timber, especially in Europe. So timber is actually mostly coming from New World colonies. So a lot of the shipbuilding timber that's being used in France is actually coming from Canada. So that's one of the raw materials being extracted. In terms of how much cloth costs in the fur trade, cloth is actually about the same and or more expensive than a gun. So you think of guns being like the thing you want in the fur trade, the thing you actually want is a blanket or 3 blankets. So you'll see the equivalencies in beavers because I don't know how to translate. Today's dollars is like 2 cents because the beaver market has declined, it collapsed because of glut, long story. But at the time, beavers are a significant amount of work because you have to go trap them and then the women in your camp have to invest the time in processing them, right? So that they are these nice pelts for the Europeans. So beaver was a lot of work to come up with. So if you have, a piece of cloth that's going for, say, 3 beavers each yard or something, I can't remember exactly. I'd have to look at a trade list or look back at something to tell you the exact price, but it's about the same as a gun.
Okay, so you mentioned that there was lots of types of linen being made, like linen from linen wool, something like that. Is there any restrictions on the types? Like, should you get imported silks or denim or fancier or denim type things? And yeah.
Okay. So in terms of types of cloth or textiles that are restricted in New France is the question.
Yes.
So what's most restricted is cottons. Cottons are relatively new. European nations are still sort of learning how cottons work and how to make good quality cottons. A lot of them are coming from India, sort of in the personal bags of sailors with East India companies. They would bring these back. They're allowed to repack it back from India. A lot of the time it was plain cotton muslin, which was controlled by the crown. It was sort of the domain of the Compagnie des Indes, the French India company, because they kind of glommed together. But aside from that, printed cottons were they were an absolute no-no in France and in New France. So whereas you have the Dutch and the English that are like, yeah, sure, printed cotton, do this another cloth. In France, because it was sort of a technology they were still trying to develop, and it wasn't a domestically produced textile, the French were very wary about people consuming NDNs, and you could actually be arrested for wearing them, especially if you're someone of a lower class and you had NDN in your possession. They would actually raid houses. They raided houses in Montreal at one point in the 1740s, looking for contraband NDN, this printed cotton. So that was the no-no. Yeah.
What's the common type of cloth?
Wool. Definitely wool. Linens are a close second. You need linens for chemises and such, but I think a lot of the linen that was used is probably going to Montreal because there is some couturier de Montreal. So there's actually a class of women in Montreal that are creating shirts and underclothes from the raw linen. They're sewing things up for sending out in the trade and for domestic consumption. Mm-hmm.
To kind of further that question, was there like a specific color that was really popular for you?
Cutler?
Yeah.
Color. Okay, not knives.
Or like, was there
Okay.
color that was restricted to? Like,
Colors weren't generally restricted. Red, blue are very popular. Whites are relatively popular too, so sort of those base colors. And that's mostly, I think a lot of what the people in Canada were probably consuming was similar to what was being imported for the fur trade, because it might have been, excess for the fur trade, or it could have been stuff that was rejected by Native Americans because they were incredibly picky consumers in a very cool way. They were directing Europeans as to what they wanted, and if you didn't have what they wanted, they're like, okay, I have other places I can go. Peace, you don't get my beaver. With the colors, like I said, it's a lot of details on stuff too, so it's a really nice red cloth, but how dark is that black band at the bottom? Because we really like that style. Very specific stuff like that, but red and blue, and to a lesser extent white, were very common.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and I saw a hand with that. Go ahead. For the French, how do they sort for wool for the Indigenous Americans?
In New France, so Native Americans were not really confined to one place, right?
Where the French were, so.
Yeah, so if they were French allied, usually they were going to the French. You could go to the British, you could go to the Dutch earlier on before the Dutch get expelled. The British are also providing similar materials, but what's very interesting about Fort St. Joseph and other French sites is most of the French sites that I have looked at, the collections for, everything there is predominantly French. There doesn't seem to be any, British, German, there's no other nationalities, which really shows that somehow, even though not everything went swimmingly, trying to enforce rules across an ocean, somehow French colonies are only consuming mostly French cloth. There's not a lot of contraband that shows up, at least, based on the seals. Yeah.
All right.
Your study is on all the lead seals coming here, but when the furs were shipped back, were any seals processed for that seal shipment?
Generally, no. I think that a lot of those would be put in bales that would be marked, because those larger bales on the port side seam, the ones that are like people sized, those are being people are just painting the numbers on. So if you go back, actually, quickly back. There's actually a guy right here, and he's got this thick black paint, probably with some oil in it, and he's painting on there where it's going, or information pertaining to transit is being put on there like that. I wish. No, there's a lot of seals that are found in Europe, but they're all European seals. So you would expect to see American stuff, and you do later on, you find a lot of guano seals. So those are New World seals, but that's 20th century. Yeah.
so,
I know. One last one. All
because it was too like specialized to make those seals here, like.
I think so, and a lot of lead sources in New France were just starting to be exploited at the time of the fall of New France, so you just have the lead sources in the Illinois country just barely making it into the system. A lot of the lead actually had to be purchased from England or Germany because there were very few lead deposits in France, which is problematic considering the amount of seals they used.
All right, thank you, Dr. Davis. Catherine will stick around for a few minutes if you need to ask any prying more questions. I just want to remind you, next week our lecture will still